Hello, everybody, and welcome to this section on Frantz Fanon. In our sections that we're reading on the preface written by Jean-Paul Sartre and chapter 1 on violence by Frantz Fanon. So I want to begin. You've been watching the movie, The Battle of Algiers by Guido Pontecorvo, which is a very excellent film, but also captures a historical moment in which Fanonian ideas, his theories, and the practices are really living themselves out in this process of decolonization, specifically in the battlefield of Algeria. So as we move forward and we're thinking of what I want to premise this discussion with, or this presentation, is to think about how violence is conceptualized. So it's easy to see and say, well, Fanon is calling for violence, and that's a complete misreading of Frantz Fanon, right? It is just a thoughtless reaction to the what he calls the violence of the state, and that's not it. So there's a lot of thinking in Frantz Fanon that centers the way we've centered this class on what does it mean to be human, that fundamental question, right? And I think as you're reading through this, the genealogy of Western thought, when we're thinking about these forms of what is the best polity, but for Frantz Fanon is how do we achieve this universal form of humanism? That's what he's concerned with. And he comes to the recognition to place that maybe the colonized subjects are not seen as human, there has been a political and economic and social process that has dehumanized them, right? And how did that happen, right? So we're just reading Charles Mills. We take the ideas of the social contract and we see how race informed that process of dehumanization. Now, in this context, Frantz Fanon is confronted with the reality as a black person, as a colonial subject, born in Martinique, educated in the center, in the metropole, in France, as a subject of the French state, sent to Algeria. And this is where he's confronted with that reality on how, as he was being utilized, he saw himself as being a weapon of the French state or French imperialism in order to maintain the colonial subjects in Algeria. This is where he does that, pulls that switch, right? He switches sides and makes that move towards decolonization. So, and just to begin with, I'm just setting the tone for how to read through, and as you're watching the movie, but also to think through how Fanon continues, in this book in particular, The Wretched of the Earth here, continues to inspire those who are faced with the brutality or the dark underside of so-called modernity, right? So here you have many movements across the earth who are moving to decolonize. On the left, or my left, you see images of the indigenous Maya in southern Chiapas, or you have those who, in the center pictured here, former members of the Irish Republican Army, or the Palestinian Front for the Liberation of Palestine. But many of these people on the ground, these individuals, were thinking through Frantz Fanon and thinking how they are to confront the violence of the state, right? So it's Max Weber, the sociologist, who told us that the state holds the monopoly on violence. The state holds the monopoly on violence. That means only they have the legitimate use of force. Right? And what is legitimate and what are those bounds? How far do they extend, right? If somebody is wearing a badge, what can they do? Can they use unlimited force? Well, we see it here. We see it with law enforcement on the everyday. How far will their badge protect them? And we see in the United States, it protects them to pretty almost infinite bounds, right? Unless it is challenged by the community, by society. And we see, and have an example of somebody else who was influenced by Frantz Fanon, former Black Panther Fred Hampton, who was assassinated by the Chicago Police Department in 1969. right? And he was in someone, again, articulating the vision of Frantz Fanon, who did not want to eradicate that universal idea of humanity, but he himself and for his community wanted to be humanized. And in essence, humanizing all, right? So it is that particular experience of Black Americans in the 1960s that Fred Hampton was speaking from, but also into reclaiming their humanity, right? As Jean-Paul Sartre gave us these universal notions of what it is to be human, what it is to exist in a just world for people of color, or the so-called third world in this period. It is a very different reality, right? And it's two sides of the same coin. You have modernity and progress for people of color. You have the dark underside, what we call coloniality, right? Those conditions of domination centered by multiple differences. And another historic example of confronting the brutality of the state during slavery was John Brown here, right? So John Brown, an abolitionist who, along with his whole family, raided Harper's Ferry in order to undo that monopoly that the state held on violence, and simply put the economic system, which was dependent upon chattel slavery in this moment. For that, he paid his price with his life. And here's a tweet that one of my favorites from a couple years back, but Pamela Anderson, if you remember, she was a big star on Baywatch. But when she's thinking about violence, right? And this caught my attention because she's talking about, I despise violence. But what is the violence of all these people and burn luxurious cars compared to the structural violence of the French and global elites? Not only because she's looking at the Yellow Vest movement in France and the rise in violence by the everyday people on the streets of Paris, that we saw those images a couple years back. But these are things that are being targeted by individuals, right? Maybe people on a very superficial level say, yes, this is violent. But she's focusing on a concept, structural violence, that was really developed by Johann Galtung many decades ago, who was looking at violence beyond simply, I burn something, I hit someone, I shoot somebody. No, we are looking at the structure where it's less visible, right? The structures, and we see that now very visible. Who has access to a hospital? Who becomes, in this time of pandemic, right? Those are structural violence. When you have areas that do not have a hospital, that is a form of structural violence, where people, due to their zip code, due to their place in the geography of the globe, the world over, by chance, maybe are condemned to a shorter lifespan. And for us, as we're thinking through, and now we're moving towards the end of this term, and not on our syllabus is the Brazilian theorist Paulo Freire, who wrote the very influential Pedagogy of the Oppressed, where he says education either functions as an instrument which is used to facilitate integration of the younger generation into the logic of the present system and bring about conformity, or it becomes the practice of freedom, the means by which men and women deal critically and creatively with reality and discover how to participate in the transformation of their world, right? So this is the fundamental premise on which we structured our course. When I asked the question, there was a difference between being educated or being trained, right? Do we, as a society, simply want to gain information, gain degrees so we can become part of that system of domination? Or do we want to move towards freedom, right? And two fundamentally different things. So as we're thinking through Frantz Fanon, and it's very, very difficult, right? What he tells us, to move away from our emotional attachments to ideas, right? So, and in this quote, when he's saying these ideas that are very strong are presented, even when people are presented with evidence that works, that shows, it illustrates, they cannot accept that new evidence. right? And this is what we call cognitive dissonance. And this is where we as a society begin to rationalize and ignore maybe the science, right? Maybe the virus is a hoax. Maybe climate change is not real. In spite of evidence presented, research by experts and scientists, if your ideology is driven by what we've termed neoliberal, well, not us, but what we've taken on to examine neoliberalism, right? Remember that economic philosophy that is premised to open up and deregulate, privatize in order for free trade to prosper. That's that rationality that drives us all. That's the rationality that drives people to risk others' lives right now and going out and saying, liberate these, under this lockdown. People begin to rationalize that, right? We're going to move from that. When we're thinking about violence also, Marx told us that force or violence is the midwife of every society, which is pregnant with a new one. It is itself an economic power. So how is history, how is revolutionary action brought into motion, right? Force is part of that. Things do not happen by us just sitting back and wishing things would happen. We have to make history occur, right? Here's an image of Frantz Fanon, born in the French territories of Martinique, as I mentioned. He lived a very short life, 1925 to 1961. These are some of the texts that he wrote in his time. I heavily recommend that you read all of these, right? Frantz Fanon did a lot of remarkable work in such a short period. And here is Jean-Paul Sartre, the French existentialist, along with Simone de Beauvoir, who was a very influential French philosopher herself. They were a couple. And he wrote the premise. Of course, he's writing from this bourgeois French sort of Marxist perspective, right? Whereas Frantz Fanon, also part of that educational elite, but marked by his difference in racial makeup, right? And very briefly, just if you want to look into the Bandung Conference, this is something that marks a period. When we're thinking of this era of the Cold War, when you have two superpowers, the United States, two imperial powers, the United States and the USSR after World War II, trying to vie for the so-called third world, these nations come together, right? So in the Bandung Conference, and thinking about how they would not align with either of the imperial powers and create a movement for the third world with these nations of color. Right? And that's where those terms, the first world applied to the United States, the second world to the Soviet republics, and the third world was everybody else who was up for grabs, so to speak. So when Jean-Paul Sartre tells us not so long ago, the Earth numbered 2 million inhabitants. We are way past that. The first possessed the word, the others borrowed it. The first possessed truth, the epistemology, the ontology. Everything emanated from the center, the core of that genealogy of Western thought. And the others, simply put, borrowed it, or they were given that imperial language, right? So between this confrontation between the colonizer and the colonized, remember this dialectic that emerges going all the way back to Socrates, right? This is how history progresses. We move through Marx, historical materialism, that confrontation of particular interests that move us towards a higher order. And for Fanon, in the end, it is that new humanity, right? Not a humanity that simply states that the I, is free, but is only applied to a portion of the earth based on their racial makeup, a la Mills. So I will pause here and I will pick up on in part 2 in a moment.